The New York Literary Festival was an event that drew the brightest minds in publishing, a place where best-selling authors, influential critics, and aspiring writers gathered to celebrate the written word. The grand atrium of the convention center buzzed with conversations, the air thick with the scent of freshly printed books, and the distant hum of panel discussions. Banners hung from the ceiling, announcing the festival's keynote speaker, a name that had become synonymous with literary success in recent years. Emma Lawson walked through the crowd with quiet confidence, her festival pass hanging from a lanyard around her neck. A decade ago, she would have never believed she would be here, not as an attendee hoping for a glimpse of her favorite writers, but as a headliner. She had spent years crafting her stories in solitude, enduring rejection after rejection, pushing forward when every doubt told her to stop. And now she was standing at the center of the literary world, not as an outsider, but as someone who belonged. Yet, as much as she had prepared for this moment, she had not prepared for him. In a sea of familiar industry faces, Professor Richard Calloway stood near one of the book exhibits, flipping through a festival program with his usual air of detached superiority. He was exactly as she remembered. His posture stiff, his glasses perched low on his nose, his expression one of quiet amusement as if everything around him existed merely for his critique. Time had barely changed him. If anything, he seemed more settled into his role as an authority in the literary world, a man whose opinions shaped careers, whose words could lift a writer to prominence or bury them in obscurity. Emma stopped in her tracks, her breath catching before she could stop herself. She had spent years outrunning his voice in her head, silencing the cruel words that had once made her doubt herself. And yet here he was standing just a few feet away, unaware of the impact he still had on her. For a brief moment, she considered turning around, disappearing into the crowd before he noticed her. But before she could move, he looked up and saw her. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by something even worse, amusement. He closed the program, tucking it under his arm as he approached her, his smirk deepening. There was no hesitation in his stride, no moment of uncertainty. He did not see her as an equal, nor did he look at her with the surprise of someone who had just stumbled upon an old student in an unexpected place. He looked at her the way he always had, like someone who did not belong. Well, well, he mused, shaking his head slightly, Emma Lawson, of all the places. His voice was the same as it had always been, calm, detached, laced with a quiet derision that others might not notice but that Emma had once felt cut through her like a blade. It was the voice that had once made her question whether she had any talent at all. She forced herself to remain still, to keep her face neutral. She would not let him see that he still had any power over her. "I didn't expect to see you here," he continued, his eyes flicking down to the festival pass around her neck. His smirk remained as he glanced back up at her, something calculating in his gaze. These events tend to attract serious writers. The words were casual, almost dismissive, but Emma knew exactly what he meant. It was the same thing he had always told her in one way or another, that she did not belong, that she was not real literary talent. A few nearby attendees had turned their heads, sensing the shift in the air. Emma felt the weight of their gazes, the subtle hush of conversations pausing as people registered the tension between them. But Calloway, as always, seemed completely unbothered. He had spent his career tearing down those he deemed unworthy, and this was just another moment of casual dismissal for him. "I have every right to be here," Emma said, her voice steadier than she expected. Calloway chuckled, shaking his head. "Still writing, I see," he said. "I assumed by now you would have realized that not everyone is suited for this kind of work. Some people simply lack the depth for serious literature." Emma felt a flicker of the old humiliation creep up her spine. He had said something similar to her once, in front of an entire class, reducing her work to nothing more than the misguided attempts of someone who didn't understand what real writing was. That moment had nearly destroyed her. But she was not that student anymore. Before she could respond, a voice interrupted them. "There you are, Emma." Margaret Sinclair, the festival's executive director, appeared beside her, exuding the effortless confidence of someone who commanded attention wherever she went. She barely glanced at Calloway as she placed a hand on Emma's shoulder, her smile warm and familiar. "I've been looking everywhere for you," she said. linking her arm through Emma's with a familiarity that left no room for doubt. "The production team needs you for a sound check. And the New York Times photographer is waiting. We really should get you backstage before the crowd realizes you're out here." Emma barely had time to react before she felt the shift in the air. The onlookers, the festival staff, the literary professionals milling about nearby. They were all paying attention now. Calloway frowned, his smirk fading slightly as his eyes flickered between Margaret and Emma. There was a brief moment of hesitation, a flicker of something unreadable on his face. He had expected this conversation to end the way it always had, with him leaving Emma questioning herself. But now, suddenly, he was no longer in control of the narrative. "I'm sorry, is there some confusion?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Margaret turned to him, as if just noticing him for the first time. "Oh, Professor Calloway," she said with polite indifference. "Right, I believe you're scheduled for the academic panel tomorrow." She turned back to Emma, smiling again. "We really should hurry. The VIP reception starts in 20 minutes, and you still need to meet with the introduction team." The realization hit Calloway then, hard and fast. Emma saw it happen in real time, saw the moment he understood exactly what was happening. Margaret wasn't leading just any guest through the festival. She was leading Emma Lawson, the keynote speaker, the very name that had been plastered on banners throughout the convention center. The author who had drawn crowds eager to hear her speak. The woman he had just mocked was headlining the festival. The shift was almost imperceptible, but Emma caught it. The way his posture stiffened slightly, the way his fingers twitched as if resisting the urge to adjust his glasses. He glanced around as if searching for some way to regain control of the moment, but there was nothing he could do. The festival attendees who had been listening in were now murmuring among themselves. Some of them had recognized her name. Some had recognized him. Emma met his gaze one last time, feeling something unexpected settle over her. It wasn't vindication. It wasn't the triumphant satisfaction she had imagined all these years. It was clarity. Calloway had spent years convincing her that his opinion defined her worth, that his dismissal of her work was final and absolute. But in the end, his words had meant nothing. He had not shaped her career. He had not influenced her success. He had simply been wrong. Without another word, she turned and followed Margaret through the crowd, the weight of his judgment falling away behind her. She did not look back. The lecture hall at Hawthorne University was the kind of place where dreams were supposed to take shape, where young writers came to refine their craft under the guidance of experienced professors. For Emma Lawson, it had been the place where she had hoped to find her voice. Instead, it had become the place where she almost lost it. She had arrived at Hawthorne filled with cautious optimism, eager to learn and ready to work harder than anyone else. Writing had always been her refuge, the one thing that made sense even when the rest of the world felt impossible to navigate. She had grown up filling journals with stories, her imagination a constant companion, but she had never been sure if her words were good enough. When she was accepted into Professor Richard Calloway's creative writing seminar, she had seen it as a sign. The course was selective, reserved only for the most promising students. Getting in had felt like validation, proof that maybe, just maybe, she had a real chance at becoming a writer. She had walked into the first class with a notebook full of ideas, eager to learn from someone whose name carried weight in the literary world. She had no idea that she was walking straight into the fire. From the very first week, Calloway had made it clear who his favorites were. There were students he praised openly, ones whose work he held up as examples of brilliance. He spoke about them with admiration, pointing out their natural instincts and intellectual depth. Emma quickly realized she was not one of them. It wasn't just that he didn't praise her. It was that he barely acknowledged her as a serious writer at all. The first time he critiqued her work in front of the class, he didn't just correct her writing. He dismantled it. She had spent hours on that short story, agonizing over each sentence, reworking descriptions, refining dialogue until it felt right. It had been the best she could do at the time, and when she had turned it in, she had felt a small, fragile sense of pride. That pride had lasted exactly 4 minutes. Calloway had held up her paper, his mouth twisting in something that looked dangerously close to amusement. He had read a passage aloud, his voice slow and deliberate, each word weighted with quiet mockery. "This," he had said, tapping the page with his index finger, is what happens when someone without a proper grasp of language attempts literature. A few students shifted uncomfortably. Someone let out a quiet laugh, and Emma felt her face grow hot. There's a fundamental misunderstanding of storytelling here, he continued. The pacing is uneven, the prose is derivative, and the characterization is shallow at best. He paused, glancing up at her. Tell me, Miss Lawson, do you actually read literary fiction? Because I'm struggling to see any evidence of it in your writing. Emma opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She felt as though she had been struck, her thoughts scattering too quickly for her to catch them. Calloway sighed and flipped through the pages, barely looking at them before dropping the story onto his desk. Some people simply aren't wired for writing, he said, almost as an afterthought. It requires a certain level of intellectual agility. Not everyone has it. Emma barely heard the rest of the class. The words settled over her like a weight, pressing into her ribs, making it hard to breathe. She had always known she wasn't like the other students. She had struggled with dyslexia for most of her life, spent years trying to untangle sentences, trying to make words behave the way she wanted them to. Writing had never come easily to her, but she had worked at it, rewriting, revising, memorizing grammar rules until they became second nature. She had thought that hard work would be enough. Calloway had just told her it wasn't. The worst part was that he didn't seem angry. He wasn't frustrated with her for failing to meet his standards. He simply didn't care. To him, she wasn't even worth being disappointed in. She was a waste of his time. She left class that day feeling humiliated, but more than that, she felt small. And it didn't stop there. Week after week, she watched as other students received thoughtful critiques, discussions about their strengths and areas for improvement. But when Calloway reached her work, his comments were cold and dismissive. She could hear the subtle shift in his tone when he addressed her, the way his voice became clinical, as if he were diagnosing a patient beyond saving. She spent countless hours in the writing center, trying to understand what she was doing wrong. She met with tutors, analyzed sentence structures, rewrote entire passages until they barely resembled the originals. But no matter how much effort she put in, Calloway's reaction never changed. She stopped raising her hand in class. She stopped offering her opinions during discussions. The confidence she had once had, however fragile, had been completely erased. By the end of the semester, she was exhausted. Her final grade in the course was a D. It wasn't just the grade itself that crushed her. It was the note that came with it, scribbled in red ink at the bottom of her last paper. Lacks fundamental talent. Should consider a profession outside of literature. She stared at those words for a long time. For weeks she debated quitting. She considered changing her major, shelving her dreams for something safer, something that wouldn't leave her feeling so exposed and inadequate. And for a while she did stop writing. She focused on her coursework, avoided anything that reminded her of fiction. She told herself it was for the best. That Calloway had simply been honest with her, and that it was time to move on. But no matter how hard she tried to push it aside, the stories never left her. They lingered in the back of her mind, surfacing in the quiet moments before sleep, in the middle of conversations, in the pages of books she couldn't bring herself to stop reading. One night, unable to sleep, she opened her laptop. At first, she just stared at the blank page. Then slowly she began to type. She wrote in secret, in stolen moments between classes, late at night when her roommates were asleep. She wrote without any expectation that it would ever amount to anything, without the pressure of an audience or a professor waiting to dissect her every word. After graduation, she moved to New York City, taking a job as an administrative assistant at a small publishing house. It wasn't what she had imagined for herself, but it was close to books, close to the world she still wanted to be part of. And she kept writing. She submitted her manuscript to publishers, only to receive 27 rejections. Each rejection felt like confirmation of what Calloway had told her. You're not good enough. But on the 28th submission, an editor saw potential. That small spark of recognition was enough to reignite something in her. She rewrote her manuscript, shaped it into something stronger, poured every ounce of herself into making it worthy of publication. When her novel was finally released, the reviews were glowing. The sales numbers climbed. The New York Times praised her voice for its raw authenticity and emotional depth. International rights were sold. A film adaptation was announced. With each success, Calloway's voice grew quieter in her mind. Yet, even after all of it, there were moments of doubt. Pauses too long in front of a blank page. Nights spent wondering if she really belonged in this world. His words had left scars, even if she no longer wanted to acknowledge them. And then years later she saw him again. She had thought she was free of him. She had thought he no longer mattered. But at the New York Literary Festival, standing in the same room as him once more, she realized something important. She wasn't his failure. She was his proof that he had been wrong. Success had not erased Emma Lawson's past, but it had reshaped it. The New York Literary Festival had been a milestone, a moment where she had finally stepped into the light as the writer she had always dreamed of becoming. It should have been the moment where she left behind the doubts and insecurities that had plagued her for years. Yet, even as she moved through the festival halls, surrounded by the very industry that had once shut its doors to her, she found herself facing a ghost from her past, one who refused to stay buried. At first, the whispers were subtle, passing comments made in conversations she wasn't part of. A critic at a networking event mentioned how fortunate she had been to have studied under someone as well-respected as Professor Richard Calloway. An editor from The Atlantic remarked on how interesting it was that Calloway had mentored her in her early writing years. At first, Emma assumed it was a misunderstanding, an assumption made by people who knew little of her past. But then she heard it again and again. Each time the story grew more elaborate, Calloway embedding himself into her narrative like a carefully placed footnote. He had not only been one of her professors but her mentor. He had recognized her talent before anyone else, had shaped her voice, guided her through her struggles, pushed her toward the writer she had become. Emma was stunned. She had spent years trying to erase his voice from her mind, the cruel words that had nearly driven her to quit writing entirely. Now those same words had been conveniently replaced with a false history, one where he had been a guiding hand rather than a roadblock. What infuriated her most was how effortless it seemed for him. Calloway had spent decades cultivating his reputation, carefully constructing his role as a literary authority. People respected him. They believed his version of events because why wouldn't they? He had been a professor for years. He had mentored countless students. Why wouldn't Emma be one of them? The truth, however, was something else entirely. There had been no encouragement, no mentorship. He had not recognized her talent early on. He had actively denied it existed. His feedback had not been constructive criticism, but a deliberate attempt to make her feel small. And yet, here he was rewriting the past as if it belonged to him. It would have been infuriating enough if his lies had remained within the walls of the festival. But Calloway was not content with simply claiming credit for her literary success. He was attempting to extend that influence even further. It was during the VIP reception that she learned just how deep his deception had gone. The room was buzzing with excitement, a blend of industry professionals and best-selling authors mingling over drinks and hushed discussions about upcoming projects. Emma had been moving from conversation to conversation when William Sterling, the producer attached to the film adaptation of her novel, approached her. "Fascinating to hear that you and Calloway go way back," he had said casually, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Emma had felt a sharp jolt of confusion. Sterling had no reason to think she and Calloway had any real connection. Their relationship had been toxic at best, non-existent at worst. But before she could correct him, he had continued. "He was telling me all about your early struggles, how he recognized your potential long before the rest of the world did." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Said he saw something in your writing that others overlooked. Apparently, you were one of his most promising students even back then." Emma had barely concealed her shock and anger. Calloway hadn't just been embellishing his role. He had inserted himself into her film deal. He had approached a Hollywood producer, someone with real influence over her career, and painted himself as the man responsible for her success. And worst of all, Sterling had believed him. Emma had swallowed her fury and smiled politely, choosing her words carefully. "That's an interesting take on things," she had said. "But I'm not sure our definitions of mentorship align." She had excused herself, her heart pounding, her mind racing through the implications. Calloway had positioned himself as a key figure in her journey, and if she didn't put an end to it now, He would continue to use her success as a way to bolster his own influence. She needed to stop him. Reclaiming the truth. That night, in the quiet of her hotel room, she pulled out an old folder, one she had carried with her for years. It was filled with pages from her college writing portfolio, a collection of assignments from Calloway's class. The comments were still there, as harsh and damning as she remembered. Hopelessly amateurish. A complete misfire. Some people simply aren't meant to be writers. And the final one, scribbled in red ink on the bottom of her last submission, lacks fundamental talent. Should consider a profession outside of literature. This was the real history, not the polished, self-serving version Calloway had been feeding to industry professionals. She knew exactly what she had to do. The keynote address that changed everything. The following day, Emma stood on stage before a packed auditorium. The energy in the room was electric, the anticipation palpable. This was her moment, the culmination of years of work, and she would not let it be stolen. Calloway sat in the third row, his expression unreadable. Emma took a breath and began. "Success doesn't happen in isolation," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It takes mentors, supporters, and sometimes obstacles that force us to grow stronger." Behind her, the screen shifted. A scanned image of one of her old college assignments appeared, Calloway's comments covering the page in red ink. A murmur rippled through the crowd. She turned, gesturing toward the screen. "This was my final assignment in my college creative writing class. My professor told me I lacked the intelligence to be a writer, that I would never succeed." The next slide appeared. Another assignment. More biting criticism. More dismissal of her abilities. Then the course evaluation, the one where he had advised her to leave literature altogether. Emma turned back to the audience. "The same professor who wrote these words has spent the last 2 days telling people that he discovered my talent," she continued. "That he mentored me." Silence fell over the auditorium. "I want to make something very clear," she said, her gaze locking onto Calloway's. "This man did not shape my success. He tried to destroy it." The shift in the room was instant. Whispers spread among the audience. Journalists scribbled notes furiously. Festival organizers exchanged glances. Calloway sat completely still, his face pale, his carefully constructed revisionist history crumbling in real time. "I share this not out of bitterness, but because the truth matters," Emma said. "For years I believed voices like his. I believed I wasn't enough, that I didn't belong in this world. And I nearly let that stop me." She smiled then, small, steady, unshaken. "But I'm here now." The audience erupted into applause. As she stepped away from the podium, Emma felt something she hadn't in years. Complete freedom from his influence. Calloway had spent years shaping a false narrative, but in the end the truth had won. By the end of the festival, the board quietly decided that Calloway would not be invited back next year. His name, once held in high regard, had been tainted. Meanwhile, the film producer who had once entertained his fictional mentorship story now wanted Emma to write her own screenplay. And just like that, the voice that had once haunted her was gone. Calloway had tried to steal her story, but in the end she had taken it back. The aftermath of the keynote speech spread quickly through the New York Literary Festival, rippling outward like a quiet but irreversible shift. Conversations in the corridors no longer carried the same reverence when Richard Calloway's name was mentioned. The festival organizers, once eager to feature him on academic panels, now regarded him with polite distance. His colleagues, many of whom had long admired his sharp critiques and literary authority, avoided him entirely. Emma had not expected the consequences of her speech to unfold so swiftly. She had not planned for Calloway's reputation to unravel in real time, nor had she intended to dismantle his carefully cultivated influence. She had only meant to reclaim her own story, to ensure that the truth was no longer distorted by his lies. Yet, now that the truth had been laid bare, it was impossible for anyone to look at him the same way again. By the time the festival's evening reception began, Calloway had become an isolated figure. His usual air of authority had faded, replaced by a quiet discomfort that he could not seem to shake. He drifted from conversation to conversation, attempting to re-establish himself, but each interaction was met with thin politeness at best, outright dismissal at worst. For years he had been a gatekeeper in the literary world, his opinions shaping careers, his approval sought after by aspiring writers. Now the very industry he had once commanded had turned its back on him. Meanwhile, Emma was being embraced by that same world in ways she had never imagined. At the VIP reception that evening, she was surrounded by publishers, editors, agents, and producers, all eager to speak with her. The weight of what had happened earlier that day was still present, but the tone had shifted. People now saw her for what she was. Not just a writer who had found success, but a writer who had fought for her place in the industry and won. She barely had a moment to process the attention when William Sterling, the producer of her upcoming film adaptation, approached her with a proposition. The studio had been preparing to bring in a screenwriter to adapt her novel for the screen, but after witnessing the strength of her voice and her command of storytelling during the keynote, Sterling had come to a new conclusion. He wanted her to write the screenplay. The offer was unprecedented. Few debut authors were ever given such an opportunity. It was a statement of confidence, an acknowledgement that her story was best told by the person who had lived it. Emma felt a quiet satisfaction settle over her. Not long ago, she had still been fighting the remnants of doubt Calloway had planted in her mind. Now she was not just an author, but a creator of her own narrative in every sense of the word. As the night unfolded, she moved through the reception with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. Conversations were filled with possibility. New book deals, international translations, collaborations with literary magazines. She had spent so much of her career feeling as though she was trying to earn a place in this world. Now it was clear she belonged. And then as she moved toward the exit, she saw him again. Calloway stood near the bar, his drink barely touched, his posture no longer that of a man who commanded attention. He hesitated before approaching, as if weighing whether the interaction was worth the risk. She let him speak first. He did not apologize, not in the way she expected. Instead, his tone was measured, carefully curated. He acknowledged the misunderstanding between them, spoke about the complicated nature of teaching, suggested that perhaps their perspectives on the past were simply different interpretations of the same experience. It was a calculated attempt at damage control. She recognized the tactic immediately, the same intellectual detachment he had always used to deflect responsibility. He was not here to acknowledge the harm he had done, but to reshape the conversation into something neutral, something he could walk away from without consequence. She let him finish. Then, without a word, she reached into her bag and pulled out a copy of her novel. With a steady hand, she opened the title page and signed it with deliberate care. When she was done, she handed it to him. To Richard Calloway, who reminded me that critics are just readers with opinions. Thank you for the motivation. For the first time in all the years she had known him, Calloway had no response. He stared at the inscription for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Perhaps he had expected anger, an argument, an opportunity to reassert his authority. Instead, she had given him something far worse: irrelevance. She did not need his approval. She did not need his validation. She had moved beyond him, and there was nothing left for him to take. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, leaving him behind. That was the last time she ever saw him. By the end of the festival, word had spread that Calloway would not be invited back. A quiet but decisive decision had been made by the organizers. His influence had eroded too much, his reputation too damaged for him to maintain the prestige he once held. The industry that had once granted him so much had let him go without hesitation. Emma, on the other hand, was just getting started. She had spent years trying to prove herself, trying to silence the voice that had told her she wasn't enough. Now that voice no longer held power over her. She had reclaimed her story, and this time she was the only one writing it. The New York Literary Festival had ended, but its impact lingered. The banners had been taken down, the grand halls of the convention center now empty, the echo of conversations that had once filled the space fading into memory. Emma Lawson had spent days at the center of it all, giving interviews, meeting industry leaders, securing new opportunities that once felt impossible. Yet, as she sat alone in her hotel room that evening, she found herself reflecting not on the offers or accolades, but on how different she felt from the person she had been just a few years ago. She had spent so much of her career carrying the weight of doubt, Not only her own but the doubts planted in her by others. She had spent years believing that Calloway's words had defined her, that his dismissal of her work had somehow shaped her journey. But now, in the quiet of this moment, she realized the truth. He had never shaped her. He had tried to stop her, and he had failed. Emma had not succeeded because of Calloway's criticism, nor had she succeeded to prove him wrong. She had succeeded because, despite every rejection, every voice telling her she wasn't good enough, she had kept going. For years, she had imagined what it would feel like to finally prove herself, to stand in front of the world and demand recognition for what she had built. But now that the moment had come, she realized she didn't need recognition from anyone except herself. She had already won the moment she refused to quit. The industry had turned its back on Calloway, but she had moved on before that ever happened. His downfall was not her victory. Her victory was standing on that stage, telling her story, knowing that she had written every word of her success herself. The festival had ended with the kind of offers most writers dreamed of. The screenplay adaptation of her novel, the international book deals, the new opportunities to collaborate with other authors. These were tangible signs of success, but they were not what truly mattered. What mattered was that, for the first time, she no longer felt like she had to prove anything. She thought back to the younger version of herself, the girl who had sat in Calloway's classroom, shrinking under his gaze as he dismissed her work without a second thought. That girl had been terrified, so desperate to be taken seriously that she had let one man's opinion overshadow everything she believed about herself. If she could go back and sit next to that girl, if she could tell her anything, it wouldn't be about the bestseller lists or the standing ovation at the festival. It would be simple. Keep writing. Don't stop. One day you'll be exactly where you're meant to be. Emma no longer needed Calloway's validation, or anyone else's. The only thing that had ever mattered was her belief in her own voice. As she packed her bags, preparing to leave New York for a well-earned break before starting her next book, she glanced at the copy of her novel sitting on the hotel desk. The cover had her name on it. Not his. Not any critic's. Hers. It was a reminder of everything she had fought for, everything she had built. The story was hers, and so was the future. The success of Beyond the Horizon had exceeded every expectation. The novel had spent months on the New York Times bestseller list, sold in over 30 countries, and was now being adapted into a major motion picture. Emma Lawson's name had become synonymous with literary success, a Cinderella story that publishers and media outlets loved to tell. At first, the recognition had been exhilarating. She had spent years fighting to be seen, battling doubt and rejection. Now the world acknowledged her talent. She had won. Or at least that's what she should have felt. But in the quiet moments between interviews and meetings, in the late hours when she sat alone at her desk staring at a blank screen, she felt something else entirely. Fear. The weight of success was heavier than she had expected. Emma had spent years pushing back against Richard Calloway's voice in her head, proving to herself and the world that she was worthy of this career. But now his words had been replaced by new voices. Critics, industry insiders, social media commentators, even well-meaning readers, all asking the same question. Can she do it again? The doubt that she thought she had silenced returned, whispering louder than before. Emma's calendar was filled with meetings, book events, and planning sessions for the film adaptation. Her inbox overflowed with invitations, literary panels, interviews, collaborations. Everyone wanted a piece of her success. First, she said yes to everything. She attended panels where seasoned authors debated whether debut success could be sustained, sitting stiffly as critics dissected the one-hit wonder phenomenon. She watched industry professionals analyze her own career trajectory in real time, discussing whether she had the range to maintain her relevance. Articles compared her to other debut novelists who had faded after their first big book. Social media buzzed with speculation. Brilliant debut, but let's see if she can pull off a second novel. Another overhyped writer? Hope she doesn't crumble under pressure. She got lucky with the first one. A sophomore slump is inevitable. Even positive comments weighed on her. I can't wait for her next book. It has to be even better. She had spent so long fighting to prove herself that she never imagined she'd have to fight to keep her place. The real struggle began the moment she sat down to write again. She opened a blank document titled New Novel. Draft 1. The cursor blinked, waiting. But no words came. She typed a sentence, then deleted it. Typed another. Deleted it again. The pressure to outdo herself made every word feel wrong. The voice in her head wasn't Calloway's anymore. It was her own. Is this good enough? What if this isn't as powerful as the first book? What if they were right? What if I only had one great story in me? Weeks passed. The document remained empty. Her editor, David Harper, checked in, reminding her that the deadline for a proposal was approaching. She assured him she was making progress. It was a lie. Instead of writing, she filled her time with everything else. Attending events, overseeing the film adaptation, doing interviews. Anything to avoid the terrifying blank page. But the longer she avoided it, the worse the doubt became. Emma tried to remind herself of everything she had worked for. She lived in a bright apartment in Manhattan, filled with books and awards. She had invitations to exclusive publishing events. She was recognized at coffee shops by young writers who told her that she had inspired them. But instead of feeling accomplished, she felt like an imposter in her own life. She had fought so hard to prove herself to others. What if she had been proving something that wasn't real? At a literary gala, she listened to established authors talk about the grind of maintaining a long-term career. They spoke about reinvention, industry politics, the unpredictability of success. One panelist, a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist, spoke about the fear of never living up to past work. Emma sat in the audience, nodding along, realizing that this fear wasn't unique to her. But somehow it didn't make it easier. Later that night, she stared at her reflection in the hotel mirror. The dress she wore was elegant, the kind of thing she had dreamed of wearing to an event like this. But beneath it all, she felt like she was pretending to be someone she wasn't. She had thought proving Calloway wrong would free her from self-doubt. Instead, it had only been the first battle. The real fight was happening now. As the months passed, Emma's self-doubt turned into exhaustion. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't writing. Every meeting about the film adaptation felt like another weight on her chest. Hollywood executives wanted changes. Bigger drama, more romance, a different ending. The book was too subtle, too literary, they said. Audiences wanted spectacle. William Sterling, the producer, reminded her that film was a different medium. That changes were necessary. That if she wanted to succeed in Hollywood, she needed to trust the process. She nodded. She agreed. But inside, she felt like she was losing control of her own story. She had fought for her voice once. Now she was letting other people shape it. The deadline for her next book proposal loomed. She had nothing. One evening, after another failed attempt at writing, she closed her laptop and left her apartment. She wandered the streets of New York, seeking something, clarity, an answer, anything. The city lights flickered. People moved past her, and she felt disconnected from all of it. At a small independent bookstore, she picked up a copy of her own novel. She ran her fingers over the cover. It still felt surreal. Her name printed on the front. The pages filled with words she had once been terrified to share. She flipped to the first page and started reading. And then, something unexpected happened. For the first time in months, she remembered why she had written it in the first place. Not to prove herself. Not to get published. Not to be successful. She had written because she loved telling stories. Because she had something to say. Somewhere along the way, she had let fear replace passion. She had let expectation silence her voice. And if she let that continue, then she really would become what they said, a writer who couldn't do it again. She closed the book, took a deep breath and walked home. That night, she opened a new document. She didn't title it. She didn't overthink it. She just started writing. Not for the industry. Not for the critics. For herself. For the first time in months, the words came easily. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like a writer again. Emma had spent years fighting for a seat at the table, desperate to prove herself to an industry that had dismissed her. She had won that battle, but success was not the end of the fight. She was learning that real success wasn't about winning against critics. It was about continuing despite the doubt, about finding joy in the work, not in the validation, and about trusting her voice even when the world questioned it. She wasn't writing to prove anything anymore. She was writing because it was who she was. And that was enough. The script for Beyond the Horizon had barely begun, but already, Emma felt like she was losing control of her own story. When she had signed the contract to adapt her own novel into a film, it had felt like the ultimate validation. Hollywood wanted her words, her characters, her vision. It had seemed like the natural next step in her career, a chance to bring her story to life in a new way. But now, sitting in a glass-walled conference room at a Los Angeles studio, surrounded by executives who spoke in terms of marketability and audience appeal, she realized how little of the film would actually be hers. The producers had ideas. Big ideas. The main character needed to be more likable, they said. The pacing was too introspective. The love story should be expanded, given more weight, maybe even rewritten entirely. A dramatic twist near the end would help keep audiences engaged. The studio needed something that would translate internationally and appeal to a wider demographic. Emma sat stiffly in her chair, her hands clenched in her lap. She listened as they dissected Beyond the Horizon, a novel she had poured her heart into, reducing it to a list of things that needed to be fixed. First, she tried to push back. She explained why the protagonist's quiet, introspective moments mattered, how the original ending was essential to the story's message. But her objections were met with polite nods, followed by counterarguments that framed their changes as necessary, inevitable. The industry worked differently, they reminded her. Books were personal. Films were collaborative. William Sterling, the producer, spoke with practiced ease, assuring her that she was part of the process while subtly steering the conversation toward compromise. He reminded her that successful adaptations always required changes. She was expected to agree. When the meeting ended, Emma felt drained. The film was moving forward, but it no longer felt like her story. Back in her temporary Los Angeles apartment, she sat at her desk, staring at the studio's notes. The words blurred together, suggestions, revisions, demands. The story they wanted was not the story she had written. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She had been given a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. She should have been grateful. Instead, she felt like she was disappearing. Days turned into weeks. The screenplay progressed, but Emma barely recognized the version of her novel taking shape. She did what was asked of her, turning in drafts with the requested changes, but each revision felt like a further erosion of what had once made the story hers. She avoided calls from her editor, David Harper, knowing he would sense her frustration. She didn't want to admit that she felt like she was failing. She had spent so long fighting to prove herself. What would it mean if she couldn't handle this next step? When David finally cornered her in a video call, his expression was unreadable. "I read the latest draft," he said, holding up his copy of the script. "It's different." Emma exhaled, rubbing her temples. "They want changes. It's just how the industry works." David didn't argue. He simply studied her for a long moment before asking, "Are you happy with it?" Emma hesitated. She wanted to say yes, wanted to convince herself that she was adjusting, evolving, doing what was necessary. But the truth sat heavy in her chest. "I don't know," she admitted. David nodded, setting the script down. "Do you remember why you fought so hard for this book in the first place?" Emma looked away. "It's not the same. A movie is different from a novel." "Maybe," David said. "But your voice is still yours. You don't have to let them take that from you." Emma swallowed, her throat tight. "I don't know how to stop them." David leaned forward. "By remembering that you don't need their approval." The words hit harder than she expected. For so long she had needed validation from critics, from publishers, from readers. And now from Hollywood. She had convinced herself that being successful meant fitting into the space she had been given. But wasn't that exactly what Calloway had once tried to convince her of? That she had to meet someone else's definition of a real writer? She had proved him wrong then. So why was she letting herself be boxed in now? That night, Emma reread the first draft of the script, the one she had written before the studio's notes, before their changes had reshaped the story into something unrecognizable. It was rough, imperfect, but it was hers. She made a decision. At the next meeting with the studio, Emma arrived prepared. She laid out her reasoning clearly, with the same conviction that had once driven her to fight for her book in the publishing world. Some changes made sense, but others compromised the very heart of the story. She refused to let them turn Beyond the Horizon into something unrecognizable. There was pushback, frustration. The room was tense, but she held firm. And to her surprise, they listened. Not to everything. Some battles were lost. But the core of her story, its quiet power, its original message, was preserved. As she left the meeting, she felt lighter than she had in months. For the first time since stepping into this new phase of her career, she felt like herself again. She had spent so long chasing success, afraid that she would lose it the moment she stopped bending to other people's expectations. But success wasn't about proving herself. It was about holding on to her voice, and she wasn't going to lose it again. The bookstore was filled with the low hum of conversation, the scent of fresh coffee from the cafe in the corner mixing with the familiar smell of printed pages. Emma sat behind a polished wooden table, signing copies of Beyond the Horizon, her hand moving mechanically as she smiled and exchanged polite words with each reader who stepped forward. Book signings had once felt surreal, a tangible reminder that her words had reached people, that her story had resonated. But now, after months of industry meetings, deadlines, and constant scrutiny, the excitement had dulled into routine. She had spent the past hour meeting readers, answering the same questions, offering the same carefully rehearsed responses. The line was still long, winding through the store, but Emma felt her energy fading. Then a young woman stepped forward, her hands gripping her book tightly. She looked younger than most of the attendees, maybe 19 or 20, with dark curls pulled into a loose ponytail and wide brown eyes filled with nervous excitement. Emma glanced up with a practiced smile. "Who should I make it out to?" The girl hesitated, then took a shaky breath. "Nina Castillo." Something about her tone made Emma pause. She studied the girl more closely, noting the way she held herself, shoulders tense, fingers fidgeting against the book's cover. There was something familiar in her nervous energy, a feeling Emma recognized all too well. Nina swallowed hard before speaking again. I wanted to say thank you. Your book. It changed everything for me." Emma set down her pen. Nina glanced at the line behind her as if afraid she was taking up too much time. But then, as if unable to stop herself, she continued. "I always wanted to be a writer. But I didn't think I was good enough. I had a professor last year who told me my writing wasn't strong enough for publishing. He said I should pick something more practical, that not everyone is cut out for this." She exhaled, shaking her head. "I almost listened to him. But then I read your book. And when I found out about everything you went through, what your professor told you, how you kept writing anyway, it made me think maybe I could do it too." Emma's chest tightened. She knew this feeling. She had lived it. The doubt, the insecurity, the crushing weight of someone else's judgment pressing down on dreams that already felt fragile. For years she had believed that proving herself to the industry, to the critics, to the people who doubted her, was what mattered. She had believed that success would silence the voice that had once told her she wasn't enough. But looking at Nina, she realized something that should have been obvious all along. She hadn't been writing for them. She had been writing for people like Nina. Emma felt something shift inside her, something deeper than professional success or critical validation. For the first time in a long time, she saw herself not through the lens of expectation, but through the eyes of someone who had needed to hear her story. Nina looked down, suddenly unsure. "Sorry, I didn't mean to ramble. I just wanted to say thank you." Emma picked up her pen again, but instead of signing quickly, she took her time. In the blank space of the title page, she wrote carefully. "To Nina, keep writing. Your voice matters more than you know. Never let anyone convince you otherwise." She handed the book back and met Nina's gaze. "Don't let one person's opinion define your future." Nina nodded, her eyes bright with emotion. "I won't. I promise." As she walked away, Emma sat still for a moment, the noise of the bookstore fading into the background. She had spent so much of her career believing that she had to fight for her place in the literary world, that she had to prove herself over and over again. But the truth was, her success wasn't just about her. It was about what it meant for others. Nina wasn't the only young writer out there, doubting herself because of one voice that tried to tell her she wasn't enough. There were more. Many more. And if Emma had once needed someone to tell her that her writing was worth something, maybe now it was her turn to be that voice for someone else. The book signing continued, but something inside her felt different. The exhaustion that had weighed on her all day faded slightly, replaced by a quiet determination. Later that night, back in her apartment, she sat at her desk, staring at the blank page of her next manuscript. But this time she wasn't afraid of it. She wasn't writing to prove herself anymore. She was writing for the ones who needed to hear it. And that was more than enough. The call came late in the afternoon, just as Emma was wrapping up edits on the latest draft of her screenplay. She recognized the number immediately. William Sterling, the producer overseeing the adaptation of Beyond the Horizon. She hesitated before answering. Every conversation with the studio had become a careful negotiation, a balancing act between staying true to her story and meeting their commercial expectations. So far, she had compromised on small things, condensing scenes, cutting secondary characters, tightening the dialogue. But something in her gut told her that this conversation would be different. She picked up the phone. William's tone was as smooth as ever, his words carefully chosen, but the message was clear. The studio wanted a major change. They had done test audience screenings with early concept materials, and the feedback was promising. But executives had concerns. The film needed to be bigger, more dramatic, more marketable. And the biggest problem, according to them, was the ending. Emma's fingers tightened around the edge of her desk. The ending was the soul of her novel. It wasn't flashy or convenient. It was earned, built on every moment leading up to it. The main character, who had spent the entire novel searching for meaning, found peace not in some grand revelation, but in something quiet and deeply personal. It wasn't a Hollywood ending. And that, apparently, was the problem. The studio wanted a more dramatic resolution. A twist, something unexpected. They proposed changing the protagonist's final decision, altering the emotional impact entirely. The audience needed something memorable, something that would spark conversation. Emma already knew what that meant. They wanted spectacle. They wanted something shocking, something that would make people gasp as the credits rolled. She barely heard William's reassurances about creative flexibility and how collaboration is key in the industry. The words blurred together, drowning under the sound of her own thoughts. If she agreed to this change, if she rewrote the ending, it wouldn't be her story anymore. But if she refused, if she pushed back too hard, she might lose the opportunity altogether. For a long moment she didn't speak. William sighed, misreading her silence. Look, Emma, I know this is tough, but think about the long-term impact. This could be huge for your career. The right adaptation can elevate you beyond the literary world. It's not just about this one project. It's about future opportunities. You want to be part of the industry, don't you? Emma's stomach twisted. That was the real question, wasn't it? Did she want to be part of this industry, one that asked her to compromise the most important parts of her work to fit a formula? For years, she had fought for her place in the literary world. She had battled rejection, self-doubt, the echoes of Calloway's voice telling her she wasn't enough. She had finally proven that her words mattered. Now she was at a crossroads. If she gave in, she would secure her place in Hollywood. She would get the exposure, the career boost, the kind of success that most writers only dreamed of. But at what cost? Would it even be her success if she let go of the very thing that had made her book special? She thought about Nina Castillo, the aspiring writer who had stood in front of her at the book signing, clutching her novel like it was something precious. Nina had told her that Beyond the Horizon had given her hope, that it had made her believe she could be a writer. What would Nina say if she knew Emma was letting her story become something else? What would the younger version of Emma, the one who had fought so hard to be heard, say if she knew Emma was letting others rewrite her words? Emma took a slow breath and straightened in her chair. She had made up her mind. I appreciate the studio's input, she said finally, her voice calm but firm. But I'm not changing the ending. A pause. William hesitated, caught off guard. Emma, I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly, she interrupted, her tone unwavering. This story matters to me. The ending matters. If I change it to fit a formula, it won't be the same story anymore. And I won't compromise that. The silence stretched between them. She braced herself for the consequences. Finally, William exhaled. That's a bold choice. Emma could tell he was frustrated, but there was something else in his voice, a reluctant respect. Then we'll have to figure something out, he said. But don't expect this to be easy. I never expected it to be, Emma replied. After the call ended, she set her phone down and closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she felt relief. She had risked everything in that moment. The studio could still push back harder. They could replace her. The project could even fall apart. But none of that mattered as much as knowing that she had stood her ground. For so long, she had measured her success by the industry's standards, by what publishers, critics, and producers deemed worthy. But real success wasn't about getting a movie deal or impressing Hollywood. It was about holding on to her voice. And she had just done exactly that. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden streaks through the window of Emma's apartment. The familiar hum of the city was distant, muffled by the quiet of her office. She sat at her desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard, staring at the blank document before her. This time there was no pressure. For months, she had been consumed by deadlines, industry expectations, and the weight of external validation. Every word she had written for the screenplay had felt scrutinized, debated, altered by voices that weren't her own. But now, there were no producers waiting for her to deliver something marketable. No critics analyzing whether she was capable of following up her first success. No online debates questioning whether she was a one-hit wonder. There was only the story. For so long she had measured herself by external achievements. Book sales, awards, interviews, film deals. It had been easy to believe that success meant proving herself again and again. But success had not silenced her doubts. If anything, it had made them louder, more demanding. She had spent so much energy fighting to hold on to what she had earned that she had forgotten what it felt like to create for the sake of creating. Now she was starting again. Not because she had something to prove, but because she had something to say. The cursor blinked on the screen, patient and steady. She took a breath and typed the first sentence. It was rough, unpolished. But it was hers. Emma fell into the rhythm she had almost forgotten. The quiet rush of ideas forming into sentences, characters taking shape, a world unfolding in her mind. She didn't overthink it. She didn't stop to wonder what critics would say. She just wrote. For the first time in a long time she felt free. The pages filled slowly, word by word, until she lost track of time. She barely noticed when the sky outside darkened, the city lights flickering to life. She was too deep in the story, in the world she was building. The rest of the world, the expectations, the judgments, the endless noise faded away. She wasn't writing for validation anymore. She was writing because she loved it. And that was all that mattered. The city was still waking as Emma sat at her desk, the first light of dawn spilling through the window. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee, steam curling from the mug beside her laptop. The quiet of the early morning had become her favorite time to write, before the world demanded her attention, before emails and phone calls pulled her away from the only thing that had ever truly mattered, the words. She had been writing for hours, lost in the story unfolding on the screen. There were no deadlines attached to this project. No contracts binding her to a specific word count or a marketable storyline. This was a book she had started for herself, without the weight of expectation. She leaned back, stretching her fingers before rereading the last few lines she had typed. The sentences weren't perfect, the ideas still raw, but they were hers. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't second-guessing herself. She wasn't writing to prove anything. Not to her critics. Not to the industry. Not even to herself. She was writing because she was a writer. The realization settled deep in her chest, something warm and steady. It had taken years to reach this place. Years of rejection, self-doubt, and fighting to be heard. Years of thinking that success was something she had to earn through external validation, from publishers, from film executives, from the world. But success had never been about the numbers on a bestseller list or a film adaptation. Success was choosing to keep going. She had come close to losing herself in the process. The pressure to follow up her debut novel, the struggle to balance artistic integrity with industry demands, the fear that she would never measure up to the expectations placed upon her. It had nearly consumed her. But now she saw it clearly. Her worth as a writer wasn't determined by a single book or a single moment of recognition. It was determined by the act of writing itself. She thought about the people who had tried to define her career, the professor who had dismissed her, the executives who had tried to reshape her story, the critics who had questioned whether she could do it again. They no longer mattered. For so long she had believed she was fighting against them, proving them wrong. But in the end, she hadn't been writing for them at all. She had been writing for the girl who had once been told she wasn't good enough, for the young woman who had almost given up, for the readers who had seen themselves in her words, for the aspiring writers who still doubted whether their voices were worth hearing. Most of all, she was writing for herself. She reached for her coffee, taking a slow sip as she gazed at the city skyline beyond her window. The world outside was waking, but inside this space, inside her mind, a new story was just beginning. She had no idea where this book would take her. And that was the most exciting part. Emma Lawson was a writer. Not because anyone said she was, but because she knew it to be true. And this time she was writing her story on her own terms. In 2025, Emma Lawson's journey is more relevant than ever. In a world where success is often measured by external validation, social media likes, industry recognition, and public approval, her story reminds us that true fulfillment comes from staying true to our own voice. As we face an increasingly competitive and judgmental landscape, whether in the creative industries, business, or personal endeavors, Emma's path offers a powerful lesson. Real success is about personal growth and resilience, not just accolades or others' perceptions. The story encourages us to embrace our imperfections and continue moving forward despite doubts, challenges, and pressures. We can all reclaim our narrative and redefine what success means to us individually. It teaches us that validation from others will never replace the quiet, powerful confidence that comes from within when we trust our instincts, value our worth, and believe in our capabilities. In today's world where expectations are high, this narrative is a call to pursue our passions with authenticity, staying grounded in our unique perspectives while navigating the noise of societal pressures. Just like Emma, we too can write our own story, one that resonates with who we truly are. As you've followed Emma Lawson's journey, you've witnessed her struggles, her triumphs, and the moments where she was faced with critical decisions that shaped her path. Like Emma, we all face moments where we must choose between compromise and staying true to ourselves. Emma's journey is not just about overcoming external challenges, but about finding the courage to trust her voice, despite the pressures of the world around her. Now we stand at another crossroads in Emma's story. After reclaiming her narrative and realizing her worth as a writer, she's about to dive deeper into her next project, not driven by validation, but by passion. But the journey isn't over. As readers, we have a unique opportunity to guide her through the next chapter. What should her next steps be? Does she continue to write from the heart? Or is there still room to embrace more challenges in the industry? Will Emma push further in breaking barriers or reach out to those who need her guidance, like Nina?